Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to CSIS. My name is Connor Savoy, and I'm a non-resident senior associate here with the Project on Prosperity and Development. In my day job, I'm the executive director of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by David Rohl, who is the author of George Marshall, Defender of the Republic, a new biography of George C. Marshall that just came out. David is a senior counsel at Steptoe & Johnson and a former partner there. But more importantly for this discussion, he's also written biographies of Harry Hopkins, one of FDR's closest advisors, and Lewis Johnson, who went on to serve as the second Secretary of Defense. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Very pleased to have you here today. So George Marshall probably doesn't need any introduction, but maybe if you want to briefly intro him for the audience.
Could do that.
Yeah.
So George Catlett Marshall, remembered, if at all, by most people today as the man with a plan, the Marshall Plan, of course. And I like to say he's not to be confused with George Preston Marshall, former owner of the Washington Redskins. During his bitterly contested divorce, Preston Marshall's wife complained to the judge, "I married a man without a plan." When George C. Marshall, as Secretary of State, was spearheading the what was called the Historic European Recovery Program, later known as the Marshall Plan, through Congress, Clark Clifford's advisor recommended that the plan be called the Truman Plan. And at the time, Truman's approval numbers were in the tank. If you can believe it, they were worse than Trump's at his lowest. And Truman responded, "If I send that plan up to the Hill with my name on it," he said, "it will quiver a couple of times, go belly up, and die." Even the worst Republican, he said, would vote for the plan. Marshall's name were attached to it. And Truman was dead right. By the middle of the 20th century, General Marshall was the most respected public figure in America. And he had risen to prominence as early as 1918 during the Great War, when he planned and he executed brilliant nighttime movement of 600,000 American troops, putting them in place to fight and win the decisive battle, Meuse-Argonne, that ended the First World War. General Pershing was in charge of all the American troops in France at the time. Was so impressed with Marshall's performance that he made him his closest personal aide after the war, his own chief of staff. And of course, during the Second World War, Marshall was chief of staff of the entire United States Army, and he organized from scratch, and he supplied and he trained an army of more than 8.3 million men and women. And he was the dominant voice in matters of Allied grand strategy, deployment of troops across the globe. And right after the war, literally after the day after he retired, he took on an assignment to go to China. He spent a year in China, trying and failing to form a coalition government between the Chinese communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Lots of luck with that. Right after that, Secretary of State, 47 and 48, pushed through the Marshall Plan, laid the groundwork for NATO, oversaw the Berlin airlift, had the famous showdown with Truman in the Oval Office over the recognition of the new state of Israel. A year as president of the American Red Cross. And then Truman called upon Marshall one more time right after the outbreak of the Korean War. He made him Secretary of Defense. And in that job, he helped rebuild the American armed forces that had been depleted following the Second World War. And he oversaw, one of the things I learned, was most surprised at in my research, he oversaw the relief with considerable deference, reluctantly. oversaw the relief of General Douglas MacArthur. And so the sheer sweep of Marshall's, and then, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in '53. So the sheer sweep of his career, 50-year career under 10 presidents, soldier and statesman, is breathtaking. So that's a quick summary.
Yeah. So I guess that raises a question of why the need for a new biography of George Marshall now? What spurred you to write this book? And in the course of writing, what did you discover new that maybe some of his past biographers like Forrest Pogue didn't come up with or turn over?
Well, Harry Hopkins introduced me in a pretty significant way to Marshall because they became friends, and Marshall, because he did not want to get too close to President Roosevelt, used Hopkins as his window, his window into what Robert Sherwood called Roosevelt's heavily forested interior. So that was one. And then the first book, the Johnson book, also introduced me to Marshall because Johnson was Assistant Secretary of War and helped Marshall become Chief of Staff of the Army. But then I started digging into it, and I found that since the last biography, the decent biography of Marshall was written, there had been an avalanche of correspondence donated to the Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. And I also became friends with and close to the son of Marshall's stepson, another lawyer, used to be in Washington, now up in the northwest Massachusetts, and spent some time with him, and he had the proverbial things that all authors want to find. He had a box of documents and correspondence that was stored beneath a bench in his farmhouse in northwest Massachusetts that became revelatory facts and information that I used in my book. So I also had discovered that there had been some recent books, 3 of them, written that I felt unfairly tarnished Marshall's legacy, his reputation. One by a fellow named O'Brien, a British author, who wrote a book entitled "The Second Most Important Man in the World: The Life of Admiral Leahy." And basically, this book was devoted to trying to prove that Admiral Leahy was much more significant figure in terms of overall strategy in the Second World War than Marshall. So it presented a challenge, and I can't believe that Admiral Leahy was the second most important person in the world, but that was the title of the book. That was the thesis. And then a recent biography by Unger and Hirshon that I felt was unfairly negative. But I wanted to challenge. I wanted to really research and test those propositions. And then the Nigel Hamilton trilogy, which of World War II, also presented some challenges in regard to the way he portrayed Marshall's performance. So, what's new? The correspondence. The themes? If there are themes in my book, they are Marshall's inner life, his interior, and Marshall's character. Those are sort of the overarching themes. But what's new is his second wife, Catherine, and how important she was to him and what her background was. In terms of World War II historians, the new thing in my book is what I call the Cherbourg or Contented Peninsula alternative that Marshall pushed for, but he was forced to push for it by Roosevelt and Churchill in '42 as an alternative to the invasion of North Africa, because Marshall thought it was a big mistake to go into North Africa. That what they really should have done is continued to build up in England and invade France in '43 instead of North Africa in '42. And as a result of going to North Africa, of course, the invasion of France was delayed another year. So I spent a lot of time at the British National Archives researching that plan and how Marshall and Eisenhower and Truscott and the Americans dealt with the British in developing that plan, which the British War Cabinet turned down. But a lot of the British war planners were in favor of what we call the Cherbourg alternative. So that's a big part of a new part of my book, new materials that came out of the British archives. The whole, issue of racism with Marshall, anti-Semitism in terms of whether he was anti-Semitic in opposing the recognition of Israel in 1948. New discussions in that regard. The Alibi Club. I don't know whether you all live in Washington, I assume, but there's a club that still exists at 1806 I Street. It's called the Alibi Club, formed in the 1880s. It's a shabby townhouse. You wouldn't know it
you
wouldn't recognize it if you drove by. It's surrounded by glass-walled
can easily miss
buildings.
it. You can easily miss it.
Have you?
I've seen it, yeah.
Well, I've been in there, and Marshall was a special member during World War II and held many of his top secret meetings with generals and congressmen and so forth. But there was an evening in January 1944, on the eve of Operation Overlord, when he insisted that Eisenhower come back to the United States. And on a January night, Marshall, as sort of the solicitous father figure, introduced Eisenhower at the Alibi Club to all of the congressional leaders, the military affairs committees, including the Speaker of the House. And it's an evocative sort of just, classic. He brought him back because he wanted Eisenhower to be introduced as Ike to official Washington on the theory that this whole invasion could fail, and he wanted at least these people to get to know him as they did. They spent an evening with him. That's if you got to know him. They were all calling him Ike by the end of the evening. So that's another kind of new sort of angle to. He also did the same thing with General Mark Clark in April. So there's other stuff.
Yeah, of course. Earlier you referenced his role in planning this troop movement during World War I of moving 600,000 American troops to the Meuse-Argonne. Can you describe some of these formative experiences like that, his earlier career in the Philippines, and how did this experience as a staff officer and not as a combat officer in World War I shape his future career?
So formative, one formative thing is when he was still at VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, senior year. In the spring, he wanted to get an Army commission, and this was after the Spanish-American War. 1901, and the Army was being cut back. It was tough to get commissions. So just as an example of his initiative, he got a train ticket to Washington, and he had a letter that introduced him to I think it was the Attorney General. His father had a relationship with the Attorney. But his purpose in going to Washington was try to lobby whoever he could lobby for a commission. He had a couple of contacts, but one day he just he waited in line at the White House, and as people went up to the second floor to meet with the president, and he got in line and ended up having a conversation with President McKinley, and told him that he wanted an Army commission, which
it's
he
one way of
eventually
doing
got.
it.
I could not prove that it came as a result of McKinley, but he had the initiative to actually get in the White House and meet McKinley at the time he was only 20 years old. He was 16 when he entered VMI, so he was young when he graduated. The key experience that I think brought him to the fore in the old U.S. regular Army was in 1914, was in the Philippines. And for various reasons, as a first lieutenant, he he ended up being in charge because the general was fired and the other people had to leave. But he ended up in charge of 5,000 troops who were doing a mock battle, invading the Philippines and trying to capture Manila against an opposing force. So he commanded the 5,000 troops of the white force and did made the strategic moves and had the mock battles and captured Manila. And his performance as a first lieutenant was noted by, among others, Hap Arnold, who at that time was also a first lieutenant. And people that saw him perform and how he strategized and commanded 5,000 troops in an amphibious landing, similar to what would happen 40 years later, reverberated throughout the regular army as he was regarded as a genius. And Hap Arnold wrote his wife at that time, said, I just met a man who will be Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army one day. Of course, that happened. Then there was a famous incident in 1917. Marshall was then a major with the 1st Division, the Big Red One. He was the second one off the boat with the 1st Division in 1917 in France. And they were training in France. Pershing was under enormous pressure to get the 1st Division into the battle. The British and the French wanted to just put these guys into the trenches right away. Pershing wanted to hold 1st Division together. So they were having these maneuvers. And for one reason or another, the general in charge of the 1st Division wasn't there, and Marshall was with Pershing. And Pershing started criticizing the performance of in this mock battle. Teddy Roosevelt's son was in this particular maneuver. And he started criticizing the general who showed up late. And Marshall stepped out. He said, General Pershing, I have something to say. I have been here the longest, and I know what the situation is. And basically then Marshall just came out with a fuselage of facts criticizing General Pershing's headquarters for screwing up some of the orders, not getting the equipment they needed, changing the terminology so that there was confusion, a whole lot of things like that. Pershing said, listen. And they said, well, I'll look into it. And Marshall then actually grabbed him by the shoulder and said, no, you don't have to look into it. I've just told you the situation, the fact. And, Pershing got away, and everybody, all of his friends, Marshall's friends said, you're done. But Pershing appreciated constructive criticism. And he then started relying on Marshall and having, conferences with him, asking him his opinions about things. Mm. And actually, it was a great, in one way, an advantage of Marshall. But as a result of that, Marshall ended up being pulled into the general headquarters and deprived of a command of troops. He did plan the first major offensive by the 1st Division. He planned and executed it. He was under fire, but he wasn't leading troops. He was under artillery fire at night when he was reconnoitering personally the battlefield. And that was the first offensive operation by the Americans as a unit. It was 2 regiments. So, and then of course he planned the Meuse-Argonne battle. So those experiences shot him up into the strategic planning ranks high up in the U.S. Army and away from the command. He did not go over the top with leading troops in World War I, and he never did. And we can talk about what happened in Operation Overlord later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To skip ahead a little bit, Marshall becomes the Army Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, the same day that Germany invades Poland. At the time, the U.S. was woefully unprepared for war. We were something like the 17th or 18th largest army in the world. We ranked behind countries like Romania.
Bulgaria.
And
Romania, one
Bulgaria,
of those.
yeah, exactly. Portugal
Yeah.
even, yeah. So we, no tanks or few tanks, old tanks, very small. How did Marshall approach this task of really going from, in 6 years, from one of the smallest militaries in the world to probably the largest military force, most powerful military force in the world by the end of the war? How did he approach this task of building and preparing the army for war?
Well, at first, he approached it cautiously. 1939, 40, the isolationists basically controlled, and Roosevelt was not about to get ahead of them. He did not want to be regarded as a warmonger. He was facing another election in 1940. Politics, I think, played a part in this. So Marshall he could not get ahead of Roosevelt. He knew that, and Roosevelt was very cautious himself about the army. Now, what Marshall needed to build the army was, the first thing he needed was money from Congress, and then he needed money. He needed manpower. That was the next. First money, then manpower, then war material, and then finally talent. And so the first thing was money. And believe it or not, when the Germans overran Europe and defeated France in May and June of 1940, Roosevelt was trying to cut the army budget. And there was a famous incident about, I think it was May 13th, 1940, when Marshall was beside himself because not only was not getting money, Roosevelt was proposing to cut the budget. So he and Morgenthau had this meeting with Roosevelt one time, May 13th. And again, Marshall did take the lead, probably for the first time, with the president. He stood over him intentionally, the president in a wheelchair. And he said, "Mr. President, can I have 3 minutes? I'm not used to talking to presidents, and I don't know how to talk to a president exactly." Marshall always felt that Roosevelt gave him this position as the best of a bad bargain. He did not know, his footing was not solid by May of 1940 with the president. But he said, I have to tell you, I have to say something right now. You have got to do something, and you've got to do it right now. And then again, he gave him the facts of what he needed. And Roosevelt at first he had brushed off Morgenthau already in that same conference, but he listened. He listened to Marshall. And the next day, he called Marshall in, and they sat down and they worked out. And the congressional spigot, began to open. Now, manpower was the Roosevelt would not even whisper about a draft because they had they had to have a draft. So Marshall's job was to convince Roosevelt that they actually needed a big army, that the British alone were not going to be able to defeat the Germans. And later, when the Soviets got into war, he had to convince them that the Soviets weren't going to be able to do it either. They needed the Americans to have an army, and that there was going to have to be a ground offensive in Europe. That was a big stretch for Roosevelt. But it wasn't until Roosevelt brought in the Republicans right after the convention in 1940. Roosevelt, it was a masterstroke, brought in Henry Stimson, a Republican, a prominent Republican, had already been Secretary of War under Taft, had been Secretary of State under Hoover. Stimson was a very strong person. He brought him in the summer of 1940, along with Knox, who was also a Republican for the Navy. Mm-hmm. And so Stimson came in and testified during his confirmation hearing that he was in favor of the draft. Roosevelt, his mouth was, kept quiet, everybody. So when Stimson was confirmed by a, on a overwhelming bipartisan basis, Stimson then led the way, and Marshall laid back until Stimson said, okay, we're going for the draft. So by October of 1940, they got the draft legislation through, and Marshall was instrumental in dealing with Congress. They believed he told the truth, and he did, even if it hurt him. But October, they had to compromise to get the isolationists to provide some support for the draft legislation. They had to compromise. And the deal was, okay, we can draft millions of Americans, but they would only be in the service for 18 months, unless Congress, at some point later after October 1940, declared a national emergency, a resolution of a national emergency. So they got the draft started, but it only had 18 months. If they didn't have a congressional resolution within 18 months, the Army would melt away. So they were under, a dagger was above them for the first 18 months. And this word, among the draftees, they came up with this slogan, Ohio, over the hill in October, the next October. They thought we'd be out of the Army. Yeah. So they had this big congressional lobbying effort, and Marshall led the way on that. And he had meetings with Republican senators. He lobbied them, meetings at the Army-Navy Club and so on. And then, of course, on the Hill. And so when it came time, when the resolution for declaring a national emergency came up in 1941, it passed by one vote. By one vote. So if it had been deadlocked or they hadn't gotten a majority, the Army would have disappeared. Yeah. And they would have. So that was building the Army. Equipment. The problem that Marshall faced with Roosevelt was that Roosevelt wanted to supply the British, and rightfully so. The British were on the line, and they were just demanding equipment. And then when the Soviets got in the war, we had to supply the Soviets. So there was a big tug of war between Marshall wanting to get the equipment he needed to train his army, and at the same time, the demands of the Soviets and the British. So the final thing is talent. And Marshall, when he was at Fort Benning in the late 20s, early 30s, was in charge of the academic program at Fort Benning, and in that was the infantry school. He trained, he assessed, he evaluated, he trained. I think it was, by the end of it, was 200 of the people that came through Fort Benning, officers, became generals in the Second World War. So he had a mythical, I don't know whether he actually had a black book, but he had a book in his head of who was good and who wasn't. And Marshall was very good at picking talent. He made some colossal mistakes, but for the most part, he picked the generals who would lead the nation in the next war. So that's sort of a summary of preparation.
You, when you were talking about that, you referenced his relationship with FDR, and these are two men who had very different personalities. FDR was very outgoing, very informal with people, and Marshall, of course, has this very formal exterior in his dealings. How did Marshall manage that relationship with the president?
Well, as I said, he wanted it to be all business. Did not want to get seduced by Roosevelt. So he used Hopkins, as I mentioned, as a window into Roosevelt's thinking. And so at first, he thought he was on shaky ground. And eventually, of course, through his performance, Roosevelt had more and more confidence in him. You know, Marshall never went to Hyde Park until the funeral, until Roosevelt's funeral, which he was asked to plan. He never, you know, got into Roosevelt's children's hour where they would have drinks after work. So it was a strictly professional relationship. And when he was asked whether he wanted to be appointed chief of staff in 1939 by Roosevelt, he said, I just want you to know, Mr. President, we're going to have conversations, and sometimes it's going to be unpleasant. I want you to understand that. And that was the basis upon which, you know, did he manage Roosevelt? No, he didn't manage Roosevelt. He came close to insubordination over the issue of invading North Africa versus the buildup in England to invade France in 43. He came very close to, he was reluctant to support the invasion of North Africa. I think that in terms of their relationship, Marshall, you know, had a, you know, he had a certain amount of contempt for politicians. And of course, Roosevelt was the master politician. But there came a moment, January or February 42, when as far as Marshall was concerned, he was convinced that Roosevelt was a great man, and the moment was when they were in the White House together, and they received a letter, 2 letters, really they were cables, from General from Quezon, the president of the Philippines at the time, and MacArthur. At the time, January, February 1942, Quezon, president of the Philippines, and MacArthur were on the island of Corregidor. The troops, the American, the Filipino troops were on the Bataan Peninsula. Manila had already been overrun by the Japanese. The Japanese basically surrounded MacArthur and Quezon's troops. So Quezon sent a cable to Roosevelt and said, basically, we're doomed. Here's what you need to do. Declare independence. Declare, at the time, the Philippines were dependent of the United States. Declare the nation of Philippines to be an independent nation. We will declare neutrality, because the Japanese are occupying. We will declare neutrality. We will withdraw the Philippine troops. And the Americans should withdraw their troops, and the Japanese will respect our neutrality, and they will back off. And MacArthur also sent a cover letter that didn't expressly approve what Quezon was proposing, but he didn't disapprove it. He suggested that, you know, let's give it a try. And Roosevelt and Marshall were sitting there, and Roosevelt read that stuff, and he looked up at Marshall and said, "We can't do this. We're not doing this. The Filipinos want to get their troops out of there, that's fine, but we're going to be there till the last man. This is our territory. We're responsible for the Philippines. Quezon's proposal is not going to work. The Japanese are going to stay there. They're never going to leave." And at that point, you know, and basically he was dooming the American troops to die or surrender, which they ended up surrendering. So Marshall believed at that point he was dealing with a very serious, and he called him, for the first time, I believed he was a great man. And that's how he regarded him for most of the time. He, of course, had serious disagreements with him.
So, I mean, we can obviously ask a lot of questions because of Marshall's career is there's a lot to plumb from this, but I do want to give the audience a chance soon for their own Q&A, and so maybe I'll ask 2 final questions of you. After the war, he of course becomes Secretary of State after the mission to China, and he has this, as you mentioned, this major role in helping formulate a lot of what we now regard as the foundations of the American post-war order, the NATO the European Recovery Plan. Can you tell us a little bit about the role he played in formulating the European Recovery Plan, the Marshall Plan, the man with the Marshall with a plan?
So he's Secretary of State in the early spring of 1947. He goes to his first meeting of the foreign ministers, Europe, and it's in Moscow. And he's there for 6 weeks, and finally says, I have to see Stalin. We're not making any progress over what we're going to do with Germany and the rest of Europe. It was a charnel house in 1947. There were, people were starving. Everything was destroyed. So he came away with a meeting with Stalin saying Stalin has no interest in helping to restore, revive, supply Germany or the other nations that had been destroyed during the Second World War. He wants it to continue to deteriorate so that the communists can gradually take over these governments and move westward into Europe and eventually to the Ruhr Valley. So he said he came back, called George Kennan, first thing he did, said we got to do something, and we got to do it right away. So he picked Kennan. Kennan was tied up for a while, but he got into the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department. He said, Kennan, I want a plan. I got 2 weeks. We got to figure out how to restore Europe. And the famous, I don't know whether it's true or not, but Kennan asked, any other instructions? He said, no, just avoid trivia. So Kennan came back with not a plan, but an outline in 3 weeks. And by that time, Marshall was pulling together people. And the people that he drew upon they were the wise men of that era. He had Atchison, he had Lovett, he had Bolin. Of course, had Kennan. And he got this guy named Will Clayton. Will Clayton was $1 a year guy in the State Department, but he was, before he joined the State Department during the Army, or during the war, he was the largest, the most successful cotton trader in the world. He was an expert in international trade. That's what he knew, and he brought Clayton in because the Marshall Plan, in part, was a trade deal. Yeah. And Clayton was instrumental in effectuating it. But Marshall was the one who brought them together, and Marshall was the one who decided how and when to introduce what became the Marshall Plan to the world. And he decided, without talking to the Truman, in fact, without even telling his own people, but he did ask people to kind of begin drafting a speech. But Marshall ended up putting the 3 parts of the speech together and actually, finalizing the speech. But the Marshall Plan speech took place on June 5th, 1947 at Harvard Yard. And it was Marshall who decided when it would be done and what would be said. And he deliberately downplayed it for the U.S. audience, but the British were alerted, and the French, to what he was saying and its importance. So Marshall was instrumental in bringing the people together and conceiving the plan and driving it through Congress. And the other really indispensable person involved in this whole enterprise was Senator Vandenberg from Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg, who was the Republicans were in charge of the Congress at this point. Yeah. So Vandenberg was a former isolationist, but now an interventionist or internationalist, and he was in charge of the Foreign Relations Committee. So the idea you had to court Vandenberg. He was a somewhat pompous guy. He always had to put his brand in anything that the Democrats would propose. But Marshall was masterful at befriending him, and they worked together hand in hand. So Marshall was instrumental in getting the thing through Congress with Vandenberg. As far as the implementation of it, it was a vast bureaucracy, and people like Clayton and Lovett and Bolin, ran it. They had people in France. They had Harriman. Harriman also was instrumental in effectuating the Marshall Plan. So it was Marshall was always, he is correctly regarded as the author of the Marshall Plan, but he by no means, it was not a one-man job by any means.
Yeah. Before I turn it over to the audience, I'll give you the easy one last. How do you assess his place in American history? He obviously doesn't, I think in other people have talked about he's not the battlefield general like a Grant or a Patton, but he really does occupy this sort of critical role as chief of staff, and then this even bigger role, as some might say, after the war when he helps plays this foundation. So how do you assess his role? Where do you put him? NATO, yeah, exactly.
Well, I think Harvard's president at the time Marshall gave the Marshall Plan speech in 1947 was James Conant.
Yeah.
And actually earlier that day, the reason Marshall came to Harvard was they were going to give him an honorary degree in the morning, during the morning commencement exercises. And the degree, I don't have the exact language, but basically Conant's award was to a soldier and statesman, who brooks only one comparison, meaning George Washington. And if you talk about a soldier and a statesman together, in terms of what they accomplished, I think the comparison is apt. Certainly is not. He doesn't eclipse George Washington, but he certainly is at George Washington's elbow. And I would regard that as an apt summary of how important George Marshall was to the American story.
It's a good place to end on. But I know we have mics, and so if there are questions from the audience, I'd love to give everyone a chance to, those of you who are here, I can continue to ask questions all day, but it's also more fun if you have some questions. Yeah, this gentleman right over here on the left-hand side, there are microphones, so.
Hi, Kevin Murphy. There's a lot of controversy as to whether a 1943 invasion would have been successful,
Right.
Including the dominance and air power in 1944 that was not present in 1943. In your research, do you have opinions, or did you find a way to judge whether or not had Marshall's preferred strategy taken place and North Africa not been invaded, and certainly Italy not been invaded, would it have been actually feasible to have conducted a successful 1943 campaign, and would that have perhaps ended the war earlier?
Yeah, so I'm not going to do a what if, but some of the factors. First of all, you had to have patience, and Roosevelt didn't think the American people would have patience to wait, to do the buildup, to do the massive buildup in England. England was like a floating aircraft carrier right off the coast of France. So if you had the massive buildup throughout all of 1942 and the first half of 43, now the Atlantic Wall wasn't really constructed until early 44, but maybe they would have done it earlier. I don't know. But if the United States or Britain and America and Canada had just massed all of the aircraft, Air Force and troops, and buildup of troops, which they never did. They never did until 44. And at that time, by 1943, the aircraft, the Air Force had drop tanks. They didn't have drop tanks until the winter of 42. So and air cover was critical. But the U.S. and British would have been able to have the largest air force in the world sitting in England by the summer of '43. Would have, and of course, then the Germans were completely occupied in the Soviet Union with hundreds of divisions. So, I'm not going to do a what if. Could have failed. And the '44 invasion could have failed. Yeah. It was a close one. Yeah. But by then, they were ready. The Germans were ready by '44. So I don't know. I think it's just a matter of speculation. The '42, the possibility of a limited invasion, really would be what I argued was that what Marshall and Eisenhower wanted to do in '42 would have been the fall of '42, to have a beachhead that they could hold in the Cotentin Peninsula, flood the base of the Cotentin Peninsula as the Germans did in '44, and just defend that territory until the buildup takes place, and then you bring them in 43. Would that have failed? Yeah, could well have failed. But it was an alternative. The whole idea, Marshall wanted to basically take the pressure off the Soviet Union, because if the Soviet Union dropped out of the war, or they sought a separate peace, we would really be in trouble. As it turned out, they didn't, and the invasion of North Africa took place. But what ifs are all over the place. I don't know. Whether Marshall was right. Roosevelt wanted that invasion of North Africa to happen because of the midterm elections. They were November 1942. And he actually, folded his hands in mock prayer when talking to Marshall and said, please, please make sure it happens before November, whatever it was, 1942. So politics was in the mind of Roosevelt when he made the decision on North Africa. I can't give you a definitive prediction on whether it would have worked. I think everything was risky at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why don't we go to this lady right here in the front? Right over here. Okay.
Yeah.
This right here. Thank you.
Hi, Ellen Lapson. You mentioned in passing that Marshall had a role in the firing of MacArthur.
Yeah.
Given his China experience, I wonder how you thought of, did Marshall think that Asia was as important as MacArthur did? He had, all of this experience in Europe, but Europe versus Asia, how do you think that fit in his conceptual thinking about where the United States had to focus its energies, even after the war?
From the beginning to the end, Marshall was Europe first, notwithstanding his experience in China. The reason I believe that he was so deferential toward MacArthur, MacArthur was a hero, a brave hero coming out of World War. I think he had 6 or 7 silver stars. He was up for a Congressional Medal of Honor, but he didn't get it. His father had gotten it. He desperately wanted a Congressional Medal of Honor. And he was also Chief of Staff in the early 30s, way above Marshall. Marshall revered him for his performance in World War I. And of course, Marshall made him into an American hero in World War II by making sure he got the Congressional Medal of Honor when he left the Philippines under orders from Roosevelt, actually, which Marshall supported. He was a brilliant commander of troops. Incheon in China, or in Korea, was amazing. Everybody opposed it, and he was enormously successful. So the evidence, though, for firing MacArthur that accumulated over a period of months in late 1950 in early '51 when he wanted to invade China. He wanted Truman to drop the bomb. He sent letters to the Republican leadership undermining Truman's. Truman was ready to settle once the Chinese were across the Yalu, but Marshall wanted to basically start a war, or MacArthur basically wanted to start a war with the Chinese. So, but at this point, Marshall was the civilian Secretary of Defense, so he was not involved with the Joint Chief of Staff. He oversaw the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so he convened the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he let them, one at a time, conclude that it was time for MacArthur to go. Truman had already made up his mind. All Truman wanted was he wanted unanimity among all of the top people so that no one could later say that they disagreed. So Marshall, though, was the last person after the Joint Chiefs decided he had to go. Marshall then said, he thought, oh, can't we bring him back? Maybe we can convince him. And Atchison convinced Marshall that MacArthur was not going to change. So Marshall then said, okay, let's go. At that point, Truman said, we're going. We're going to fire him. It was just, and I think Marshall was an institutionalist. He believed that MacArthur was important to the reputation of the U.S. Army, and he was. And so that's why he was reluctant. But in the end, when he testified in Congress during the hearings over the firing of MacArthur, Marshall eviscerated MacArthur's position. Basically, he said, he's a theater commander and he doesn't understand the overall significance. And one reason, to your point, Marshall wanted to be able to defend Europe. He was more worried about the Soviet Union in Europe than he was about the Chinese in Asia.
I think, ma'am, you had a question right here, this woman right here, and then this gentleman.
Yes. For the intelligence services right before the war and during the war, how close was Marshall in helping to develop, and how instrumental was he in funding? And
Ma'am, could you speak up a little bit?
How instrumental was Marshall in funding, informing the intelligence services in the Pacific and in Europe, the European theater during the war?
What role did Marshall play in setting up the intelligence services during the war and after the war, I think is...
I don't know much about that. In other words, in my research, I didn't focus on his relationship with it. I know he didn't have much to do with the OSS, but in terms of the Army intelligence services, I don't know how closely he worked with them. I do remember that one of his famous comments was that the intelligence services his intelligence service failed him in Normandy. He said they never really focused on the difficulties of fighting in the bocage.
Yeah.
He said that was an enormous intelligence failure. They weren't ready for the difficulties of fighting in the bocage, the
hedgerows.
The hedgerows, right? So the answer to your question is I don't know much about how he dealt with the intelligence services on east or west.
I think this young man had. And then there's one more, and we'll do this one, and then let's take this one together, and we'll do these last two questions.
Thank you, sir. My name is Chen. My question is, what was Marshall's immediate reaction to the result of China's civil war after nationalists lose mainland China? Did he take any action to facilitate the defense of Taiwan? What was his input?
No. See, he was done with being Secretary of State. Actually, he was he had an operation, where he was diagnosed with kidney failure in the summer of '48. So he was limited from that point on, and then he ended up, he left the State Department in November of 1948. So the Chinese were, by that time he'd been out of China for a couple of years. And of course the Chinese communists solidified their battlefield successes, and I guess the PRC was recognized in October 1949. So by that time, Marshall was well out of it. So he never advocated defense of at that time Formosa, Taiwan. He was totally frustrated with his experience in China, and his hands were tied behind his back. And he was in China only in '46, and at that time, he negotiated a truce of the warring parties. He almost got a coalition together in early '46, in March of '46. But he left. He came back to the United States to raise money for the effort. He had to raise money in Congress to provide support to the coalition government. And he was gone for 6 weeks. And when he came back, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek told him to get back here, that the place, it was falling apart, and it did fall apart. So the rest, from March until the end of '46, there was one truce, and then there would be battlefield success by one party, and then they say, okay, let's have a truce, and the other guy would. So and the generals were basically breaking the truce all the time. Chiang Kai-shek had lobbyists back in Washington. I think at one point they had 11 different lobbying firms lobbying for the China, what they called the China lobby, and they had him loose in Time magazine. So Chiang Kai-shek knew that if he did not cooperate with Marshall, the U.S. would still support him. He would still be the legitimate government. So Marshall was never treated as an independent or neutral arbitrator. He was always the arm of Truman's arm for Chiang Kai-shek. He was never. He said, they lost trust in me. They lost trust in me. He had trust at the beginning, but they lost trust in him. It was a failure for him, and of course, the Republicans took advantage of that in the McCarthy movement. Took advantage, and they believed that, and they created the story that Marshall lost China, but China was not Marshall's to lose, nor was it ours to lose. I think people say that in the end, the Mao Zedong's Chinese generals were superior to Chiang Kai-shek's generals. They were better on the battlefield.
Yeah. And then last question to the gentleman in the back.
Dr. Dan Burkhart, National Intelligence University. I know the documentation is limited, but can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Fox Connor and Marshall?
Well, yeah, Fox Connor. Marshall did not. During World War I, they were together in the headquarters, and so there were the famous incident in the war, World War I, that I talk about in my book, where Fox Connor is basically running the war for Pershing at that point, and it had to do with the final battles of the war. So Marshall was very close to him. He, are you ready to go? Yeah.
Oh, no. I was just leaning forward.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Marshall was very close to Fox Connor, learned a lot of him. But Fox Connor himself was really impressed with Marshall, and he told Eisenhower that when Eisenhower was working for Fox Connor, he told Eisenhower that he needed to work with Marshall, that Marshall was the smartest and most accomplished strategist, and this was on the eve of World War II. But he told Eisenhower he needed to work with Marshall. So did they have a close relationship? I don't think so. I don't get the sense they did. They worked together in World War I closely. You read the part of the book where Connor is telling Marshall to do something, and Marshall is basically trying to not follow Fox Connor's demand. He didn't think he spoke for Pershing. So that's about as much as I know about their relationship.
David, thank you. This
Yeah.
has been wonderful. Very welcome distraction from everything else that goes on in Washington. It's a wonderful book. I'd urge everyone to read it. I've read it, and I think it's a great addition to our understanding of George Marshall and the role he's played in American history. So
Thank
thank
you.
you so much.
Yeah.
Join me in thanking David.